Well, joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Reza Marashi. He's a research director for the National Iranian American Council. Thanks very much for joining us. So what is going on? What signals is Iran trying to send? It's agreed to resume nuclear talks, but at the same time, it's halted sales of oil to British and French companies. It's dispatched Navy ships and it's holding military exercises.
That's right. It's a great question. It's not a coincidence that at the same time that Iran has responded positively to the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany's letter requesting new talks, they also put on a nuclear show, and they move forward with this oil issue regarding the UK and other actors and other issues that the Iranian government is moving forward on. And I think they're trying to signal to the West that they'll come back to the negotiating table, but they're not going to capitulate what they consider to be their nuclear rights as a result of this unprecedented amount of pressure that they're facing from the West. So what that means at the end of the day is when negotiations resume, if the West expects Iran to capitulate its rights, then these negotiations are going to fail. So what the West needs to do, what I would advise the West to do, is to seriously consider what Iran's security interests are, and then also seriously consider whether it's in America's interest and Europe's interest to address what Iran's security interests are. That's what's going to be the driving force regarding whether or not these negotiations can be successful, and it'll be the driving force regarding whether or not we can move past a lot of the mutual escalation and the overall cycle of conflict that we find ourselves in.
Okay, going into these talks, when is yet to be decided? The expectation, the hope, I believe, is that Iran will halt all enrichment activities. Is that at all realistic? What can the U.S. and the West offer Iran in exchange for this?
Oh, that's another great question. I think what the expectation of the West is, at a minimum, is that Iran will halt all of its nuclear activities at its Fordo facility in Qom. It will halt 20% enrichment, and it will ship out all of its 20% enriched uranium out of the country to be held in escrow elsewhere. So what is expected of Iran is actually rather clear. What Iran gets in return for giving up these strategic assets is less clear. Right now, administration officials say no further Security Council resolutions or sanctions on Iran, and medical isotopes for Iran's research reactor would probably be the proverbial carrots being offered to Iran. I don't think that's going to be something that the Iranian government finds to be particularly intriguing, given that no new Security Council sanctions are in the offing, and Iran is introducing 20% enriched uranium at its Qom facility to indigenously produce these rods for the research reactor. So we're at a bit of an impasse now, but I think we're at the very beginning stages in the run-up to these negotiations taking place. So a lot can happen between now and when the negotiations commence. So there's going to be a lot of backroom politicking and a lot of maneuvering to try to figure out whether or not the political space in Washington and Tehran will allow diplomacy to be successful.
And meanwhile, how tense is the situation between Iran and Israel? The U.S. President Barack Obama has said that Israel and the U.S. are working in unison to counter Iran. But how much concern is there that Israel might take matters into their own hand and strike at Iran unilaterally?
I think the United States government has been very clear, and General Dempsey only being the latest in a staggering amount of American officials that have said, A, they're very concerned about Israel acting unilaterally, and B, it's not in Israel or America's interest for Israel to do so. I can't think of another instance in which numerous American military and intelligence officials have come out and said unequivocally that this would be a bad idea. So that being the case, I think there is a bit of bluster in what the Israeli government says regarding military strikes on Iran. But Israel also does have very real psychological and security concerns that need to be addressed. The issue is, how do you address them? And how do you address America's security interests and concerns and Iran's security interests and concerns? We've been trapped in this paradigm of conflict for quite some time now, and diplomacy really is the only thing that hasn't been truly pursued. So moving forward, I think the administration, with the National Security Advisor in Israel right now, and with Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to America for the AIPAC conference in the coming weeks, will try to get back on the same page with the Israelis, try to get in lockstep, as the administration likes to say, with the Israelis, and convince them to give diplomacy a chance, because I do think that the Obama administration has reiterated multiple times that it's certainly their preference, but being the leader of the free world, it's going to take President Obama to take risks for peace, and that's not something we've seen so far.
Reza, thank you very much for your perspective. Reza Marashi, Research Director from the National Iranian American Council.